She also co-edited the Routledge Companion to Media and Fairy Tale Cultures, co-edited with Greenhill, Naomi Hammer, and Lauren Bosc. It was published in 2018. She teaches courses in folklore and writing and co-directs the Fairy Tales on Television Digital Humanities Database and Research Project. And she also serves as an associate chair in the English department and as a nursery leader in her church congregation. I was amused by the connections between those two roles. She and her husband, Bill Rudy, the BYU Recycling Coordinator, are parents of 3 children, 1 son-in-law, a soon-to-be daughter-in-law, and they enjoy living in Provo, visiting Draper, and Westchester County, New York, spending time on Cape Cod. And I wanted to just also mention that Professor Rudy is actually one of my professors when I was in college. And so it's just a really special honor for me to be able to introduce her and be able to have her share some of her research and scholarship with you. So if you'll join with me in welcoming Jill Terry Rudy to the stand.
Thank you, David. And thank you for being here today. I appreciate that Snow has this Convocation series and that you are here with us. And I appreciate the invitation from David to be here. One of my happiest mentoring moments as a professor was when he called me for a recommendation of another of my students, Lauren Matthews, and I got to tell him how awesome it would be if she could come here and teach as well. So I appreciate them. And we love this valley also. My husband and I were married in the Manti Temple, and so we love this place. We have dear friends who have lived here. We appreciate the people who are living here now and the people who were settlers and the indigenous people who lived and cared for this land. And so I'm really happy to be here at Snow today. And I'd like to talk about fairy tales and television. And that might be a combination that doesn't make sense so much at first. And that's why I kind of have this unwieldy title, Contemporary Antiquary Stories of Hope and Make-Believe. I received a PhD in folklore from Indiana University, and I have been at BYU since 1996. And David mentioned some of the projects that I've worked on. I guess my title is suggesting, how can anything old still matter in contemporary society? Can anything from long ago and far away still be relevant and relatable? Why do we tell and retell fairy tales? So I'd like you to start thinking about your own experiences that you've had with fairy tales. And I make a guess that there are a few people, and I know Lauren is one of them, who think about fairy tales a lot right now. And maybe there are some who think about them every once in a while, and some of you maybe haven't thought about fairy tales for a very, very long time. But I'm guessing that they're somewhere back there in your memory that you have had experiences with fairy tales. So I have a few invitations. I'd like you to consider the stories that you take into your lives. Fairy tales tend to come in pretty early, and along the way, we accrue other types of stories. So what kind of stories have been part of your past? What kind of stories are you telling yourself now? What other types of stories are you taking in from the world around you? I want you to read closely and think critically about fairy tales and your television viewing practices, because my guess is maybe you haven't thought about fairy tales for a long time, but you probably have watched TV in the past day or two. So we're going to think more about that relationship of fairy tales and television. So I invite you to be self-aware about your media and your story choices, ask questions, and take responsibility for the choices. I don't know if you noticed this about professors, but we kind of tend to think that what we think about consumes the whole world. So I made this cheesy Venn diagram to remind myself that me that television, there's a lot of television that doesn't have anything to do with fairy tales, and actually there are a lot of fairy tales that never are going to show up on TV. Relating back to my invitations for you, I wonder how much your actual lived life and your media viewing overlap. And I'm guessing that maybe for some people, it's a bigger overlap than this, and for some it might be smaller, because I know that there are people who are fans and they get very attached. And when I talk about media, it can be face-to-face communication. I count books. I'm an English professor. Let's get books still in there. But also media as you might think of it. TV, movies, whatever you're looking at on your phone. Well, Facebook, other sources that are beaming things at you, all of that counts. So I have another invitation. I invite you to create and share your life story to make a more marvelous world. You're needed and your hopes matter. That's the main takeaway I hope you get from thinking about fairy tales and TV with me today. I hope that you can joyfully become the curator and designer of your own life story, and in part by thinking about the media that you watch and the stories that you listen to and that you tell and create. I hope that there are many types of creators in this room. That's something I've noticed about Snow College. It affords many ways of making and creating, and we have a world that needs that. So I want to talk a bit about where to find fairy tale TV, why it matters, what fairy tale TV does for us, and how to do things with fairy tale TV. You can maybe see some of these fun facts about television. The word was coined around 1900, and tele means bringing from far near. So bringing vision from far near is what television's doing. One of my favorite histories about television is called 4,000 Years of Television. And it was written in the 1940s before many people even had television sets or there was any content. But people wanted to be able to do this. They had a sense that there must be a way to see things from a distance and bring them close. And it started happening in the 20th century. So over 1 million Americans had television by 1948, and then by the 1960s we had satellite TV, and now we're at the phase where we really wonder, is it even TV? When you're streaming something on your phone, where are we with television? But I think that I see enough continuity that it's still going to count. So, as David mentioned, I co-direct a project about fairy tales and television, and when we made the Channeling Wonder book, a research assistant, Kendra Magnus Johnson, made a teleography of every show that related to fairy tale that she could find. She made a bibliography. And when I learned about digital humanities and that computers could aggregate data and then show patterns, I wanted to see what that bibliography looked like in an aggregate. So this graph behind Visualizing Wonder, each red dot represents a TV show, and the blue dots represent a fairy tale. And so it shows how they cluster, and we learned that Snow White was more central to what fairy tales have been shown on TV, and Cinderella was, at that point, the fairy tale that had appeared the most on television. And we have asked interesting questions. I've had a number of wonderful student research associates over the years, including Lauren Matthews, and they have asked questions about this data, and they've come to some conclusions that I may mention along the way. Okay, this may help you. If you weren't having any fairy tale TV shows come right to your mind, this may prompt your memory. And these fairy tales appear in all sorts of television shows. Fantasy is the category that comes up the most, and that might not be too surprising because that's a big component of what makes a fairy tale a fairy tale. I don't know. Anybody remember adventures from the Book of Virtues? Raise your hand. Okay. Merlin? Okay, a few. Beauty and the Beast, either the 1987 version or the CW 2012-ish version. Ooh, okay. Anybody remember Jim Henson's The Storyteller? Yeah, okay. Animation. We have about 1,800 entries in our database, and about 600 of them are animated. So I don't know if you've heard of these. Happily Ever After, Fairy Tales for Every Child. Hello Kitty's Fairy Tale Theater. Okay, you maybe haven't heard it, but now you have, so yes, you can Google, you can check it out. Mikhail Baryshnikov's Stories from My Childhood. Anybody heard of that one? And Rocky and Bullwinkle's Fractured Fairy Tales. Okay. Drama. Now, there are fewer that appear in the drama category, but fairy tales aren't just all happily skipping through the woods. When people happily skip through the woods in a fairy tale, a wolf comes along, and so there can be some drama. Castle. Okay. Another fun fact. Did you know that Meghan Markle was in the TV show Castle as Sleeping Beauty? One of my student research associates, she liked the royal family, so she was very delighted when this popped up in the database. And I will leave it to you to find out what her role was in that Castle episode. You can go to fttv.byu.edu. We don't have great mobile, so it's better if you do it on a laptop or a computer. And you can search the database, and we have lists of all the TV shows that we've included and all of the fairy tales. And you can put in dates, so you could look at just the 90s if you're a 90s fan. So some others, you may recognize Grimm. Yes, anybody still Grimm? And Once Upon a Time. Okay. And comedy. Now I think it's almost easier to understand a dark side to fairy tales than a funny side to fairy tales. Although, those of you who know Rocky and Bullwinkle's Fractured Fairy Tales, you know that there's humor, there's wit. Lost Tales of the Brothers Grimm, Fairy Tale Theater, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Okay, some student of mine figured out in that episode that it was both comedy and drama. I think there was that mix. And then Sesame Street. Yeah, everybody still knows Sesame Street? Yeah, okay. So here's some images to go along with these ideas. This is Julie Andrews, and she was in Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, which they wrote specifically for television. Back in 1957, some movie people didn't really like television coming along because they saw it as a big competition. Walt Disney was someone, actually, who caught on to TV pretty quickly, and he even made a show called Disneyland that he brokered so that the TV show could help him afford to make Disneyland. Another fun fact. Broadway also got along pretty well with television, and so some of those early shows would be Broadway productions. And Rodgers and Hammerstein's wrote Cinderella and had Julie Andrews. Here's our Fractured Fairy Tales. Here's the 1997 version of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, starring Brandy as Cinderella and Whitney Houston as the fairy godmother, and a multicultural cast, which helps us see how society was changing It's interesting, though, to think we've gone from 1997 to past 2017, and it still is a big deal that it was a multicultural cast. So that tells us something about our society, too. And we got grim. So to me, TV and fairy tales go together. I'm calling it a domesticated wonder. Okay, when you go to a movie, still, you go out. A movie somehow feels more public. I got to talk today visit Lauren's folklore and literature class, and the students said they were more likely to watch a movie on TV with people than some other type of television show. Now, that's not all, I also learned about show cheating, which I had never heard about, where you can't get ahead of your spouse or sibling or parent if you're all watching the same show. The domesticated wonder part means that, to me, that television came to our homes. It was a piece of furniture for a long time that people kind of built their living rooms around sometimes. It's more mundane. Television, once it got going, was always there. And I think we don't think about TV so much because it's there all the time. Just like maybe we don't think about fairy tales because they were more back in our childhood. But they're no less wonderful. How did those little people get on the screen? Okay? I'm an English professor, and I can't do the technology about that. But I think we sometimes forget the wonder that's associated with what television does and represents. So I'm hoping that we can, even if it's familiar and kind of mundane, we can still recognize the wonder that's a part of it. This is a lame professor answer. Most professors would not say simply, fairy tales stick around because people like them. But we do. We keep telling them in every new communications technology. Movies came along, people told fairy tales, made fairy tale movies. They told them on the radio, they tell them on television. People have told fairy tales on Tumblr. We like them and we move them along. Even if they seem like old-time stories, we keep telling them as we get these new technologies. Why do we like them so much? They're entertaining, they're fun. Sometimes freaky things happen, and it ends up all right in the end. That's a pretty good thing to think about and think with, if the world could work that way. So what do they do for us as individuals and a society? Are we supposed to outgrow them? Could they be a cultural inheritance that deserves to be passed on? Even some television shows? Okay, I'm going to make one little break. This would happen all the time with our research group, that we would veer off into movies and we would do an event around the next Disney live-action Beauty and the Beast or something. But I am going to say, I've heard 2 fairy tale scholars say that Harry Potter is going to go away. They, for some reason, don't like Harry Potter. And I see already that Harry Potter is getting passed down from generation to generation. And I think that there may be TV shows that have done that too, that your parents introduced you to something that they watched. Like, I'm wondering how you know fractured fairy tales. Okay, here we're going to get some definitions because I am a professor. As a folklorist, fairy tales are just one little part of folklore, so I could do one of my lame Venn diagrams about that too. Folklore is the study of tradition, and a key part of tradition means that it has continuity and it changes. One of the things fairy tales promise is an unbroken link with the past. I'm going to show you a picture of Marina Warner in just a minute. Simply, in our Channeling Wonder book, we just said fairy tales are traditional narratives of wonder and magic. So I just said tradition is continuity and change. So part of this is there's going to be some part of the story that's similar over time, and something changes. And then Vladimir Propp plotted out 31 different aspects of a story, but the main one was there was some sort of lack in a fairy tale, and then by the end of the story, that lack went away. It was liquidated. And that's often why fairy tales have a happy ending. Okay. C.S. Lewis on 3 Ways of Writing for Children. A child does not despise real woods because he's read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all real woods a little enchanted. So this is one thing that of the many things that fairy tales do for us, I want to emphasize that fairy tales offer hope. They offer possibility, what might be. Yes, it might be a wolf, but there might be the huntsman who comes along and cuts you free, and somehow you survived. There may be stories about enchanted woods, and they make all real woods a little enchanted. Here's Marina Warner. She uses the phrase optative mood. That's announcing what might be. So that's the hope part of my title. Fairy tales tend to announce what might be. Okay, I'm really going to sound like an English professor for a minute, and I'm going to talk about grammar and about mood. Mood helps us show an expression towards an action. And so an imperative mood, maybe this is like going to click back to high school. An imperative mood is what has to be. So a great one comes from Alice in Wonderland. Off with their heads. A more domestic one could be, go to your room. That's imperative. It has to be. Indicative mood is just what is. Sally went to her room and pulled off her Barbie's head. Okay? And then the optative mood of what might be, Sally pretended that she was talking to the Queen of Hearts, who said, off with their heads. So she pulled off her Barbie's head and then put it back on, pretending that they were all going to get to go to the tea party. Optative mood, what might happen. And think about how often in your life we would get along better if we remembered not just what has to be or what is, but what could be. Warner also said, fairy tales are stories that try to find the truth and give us glimpses of greater things. She says this is why we keep telling them and why we keep spreading them in all sorts of media. This is the principle that underlies their growing presence in writing, art, cinema, dance, song. So I suggest that we outgrow fairy tales at our own peril. We need these plots that are pretty predictable and the characters that are pretty flat, along with those supernatural wonders, to help us forge our mortal existence. Things are going to go wrong, but we may have a helper come along. And we may have an enemy, but we may come off victorious. And then someone may be a false hero, but then we're going to be recognized as the true hero, and we're going to get a reward. So when I was a child, I liked the story Snow White and Rose Red. There was Childcraft Encyclopedia had these storybooks, and I liked to read this one because it was a different Snow White. So I can kind of read back and think, oh, remember folklorists like continuity and change? I liked that it said Snow White, but I liked that it was not the same Snow White because Disney's Snow White terrified me. My cousin had to take me out into the lobby when we were watching the movie because I was so freaked out by that witch. And so I liked that there was Snow White and Rose Red, a different sort of Snow White story. I was the big sister, and so this was a sister story. I liked that part of it too. I reread it, okay? Have you revisited things from your childhood and then kind of found, oh, that's not quite the same? So I reread this story recently, and it was pretty sappy. The start was very glowing. These girls never did anything wrong. They lived in the cottage with their mother. The rose bushes, the red one and the white one, grew right by their cottage door. Snow liked to do cleaning. That she does have that in common with Snow White, the other one. And Rose Red liked to play in the forest, but nothing happened bad to them. They slept over in the forest, and nobody hurt them. They even had an angel come and protect them from falling off a cliff. But then one day, in the winter, a knock comes at the door, and it's a bear who wants to come in. And they know he wants to come in because he talks to them, and he tells them. Yeah, there we are, fairy tale land, when we get talking bears. I think, though, actually, my favorite character was the grumpy elf, the grumpy dwarf, because here are these perfect sisters. They help him. He gets in all sorts of trouble. His beard gets caught in a tree. It gets wrapped around a fishing pole, and the fish is almost pulling him into the water. And Snow White comes along with her little scissors that she happens to have and cuts him free. And they were being good. But he didn't think them. He just got kind of mad, and he stomped around. And he, sometimes I felt as a kid, and sometimes still now, a little more like the grumpy dwarf than like the precious sisters. He eventually really wants to hurt them, so the bear reappears, and he dispatches the dwarf, lesser or more degrees of violence depending on the version, and then he turns into the king's son and wants to marry Snow White, and suddenly a brother appears and is there to marry Rose Red. This appears in our database 6 times. There's one version I'm going to tell you about that we haven't included yet, and they make some tweaks. Grimm's Fairy Tale Classics adds a brother early on who's looking for his lost brother, so that helps kind of fill that gap of the odd appearance of the convenient brother. One more thing from me. Fairy tales are like prismatic jewels that we can kind of make them shine onto all sorts of facets of life, but I'm going to mix the metaphor, and they also are like skeletons that are the bare bones of a story. And so we sort of recognize that pattern in all sorts of other stories, whether they're on TV or in movies or in books or in our own lives. They kind of give us a sense of how things can go. Skip that one. So there is the National Association of Media Literacy Educators, and here are some questions to ask about the media that we let into our lives. Who made this? Who was it for? Who paid for this? What actions might I take because I watched this? What would someone learn from this? How do the techniques communicate the messages? What do I learn from this? And then some context. When was this made? How credible is this? How do I know? Consider the source. As part of thinking about how the stories we take in become part of our life stories, I wanted to share with you some stories of 2 women who loved fairy tales as a child and eventually found ways to make stories to share with other people that involved television. So Nicole Cody is the creator and showrunner for Adventures of Snow White and Rose Red. Has anybody watched this? It was on Amazon last year. I'm not surprised. It's very family-oriented, and I can't tell if they got a second season. So it's still a really cool story. So she grew up in New York, and she loved to read, hear, and play fairy tales. This is from an interview in a magazine called Biz Women. and I just wanted to read it in her words. She said, "My mother read them to me every night as a child. I had a few big, beautiful fairy tale books I remember sitting with and just looking at all the wonderful pictures for hours. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, I had a friend who also loved fairy tales. We used to play a pretend game where I was Snow White and she was Rose Red. We had a great time." Okay, then she grew up and she went to Vassar College, which is also in New York. She took a fairy tale class. "It was fascinating," she said. "Working with stories on this level can be wonderfully healing, inspiring, and a great way to learn how to overcome challenges in the real world, all just through experiencing the stories and the symbols." She was a film major, so she went off to Hollywood. She worked for production companies. She got married and decided that she wanted to leave the Hollywood life, and she moved back to upstate New York, where she was a stay-at-home mom. And she talks about that generational thing, sharing fairy tales with her daughter, and she says, they found new ones. "When my daughter got older, though," this is quoting her again, "I got a major itch to jump back into the world of TV and film. I literally have to create stories or I go a little nuts. I was excited about the idea of producing and directing my stories. I never got the opportunity to direct my own work. With my passion for fairy tales reignited, living in beautiful upstate New York, which has an abundance of magical forests, lakes, and wild gardens, I began to see I could really make a show like Snow and Rose happen." At this time, I met Andrew and Katie. We were all serving on the board of the Saratoga Springs International Film Festival. We really hit it off. Andrew understood distribution. He and Katie had been involved in a lot of filmmaking, and I had my Hollywood experience. We formed our production company, Trident Fantasy Films, together. I pitched them the idea for Snow and Rose, and they loved it. So she loves fairy tales as a child. She studies them. She goes off and has experience where she learns how to make shows, and then she leaves that behind, but still loves the fairy tales, and she stays involved. She got on the board of that film festival, and she met other people who loved to make media, and they decided that they could make a company, and they pitched it enough that Amazon accepted it. Okay, I'm going to tell you about Lani Reiniger from a very different time period. 1899, she died in 1981. She made films, animated films from cut-out silhouettes. She also loved fairy tales as a child, but she grew up in Berlin. And there was a tradition there of making paper cutouts. And she was really good at it, even as a child. So she would make little shadow puppet theater shows as a kid. When she was 17, she went to a lecture called New Goals of Cinema. Paul Wegner was a director and an actor, and she kind of followed him around, and I kind of picture her like cutting out her little paper things and like showing him what they could do. So he actually figured out ways that he could use her cutouts in some movies, and he introduced her to some other people in the Institute for Cultural Research, and they started making movies together. Disney's Snow White may not have been the very first full-length animated feature, because in 1923 to 26, she made, with her silhouettes, a full-length animated film called The Adventures of Prince Ahmed. During World War II, she moved from England to France to Italy, and then her mother was ill, and she moved back to Germany, actually at the end of the war, to help her mother. And all along the way, she was involved with production companies and with making films. And after the war, she and her husband, who also helped her make her movies, he was more the technical side and she was more the artistic side, they settled in England, and they, with friends who had been part of the earliest production, and a son from one of those men, formed the Primrose Production Company, and they made silhouette films of fairy tales that appeared on American and British educational TV in the 50s. I encourage you to you can find on YouTube, Lani Reiniger, Snow White and Rose Red. And it's only 10 minutes long, so I encourage you to watch it and think that she cut out every figure and she moved it slightly to make every bit of that animation. She would just move the character and then take another shot, and that's how they did the animation. So she also had a love of something in her childhood that she figured out how to study and learn more about as she grew up. Because of following that passion, she met people along the way and got other connections, and wars, things happened, but she still was able to keep doing what she loved and what she was really good at. So I encourage you to think about what do you care about? What have you loved? How can you learn more about it? Who do you know now that can be a mentor to you? That's a great thing about being in college. Part of college is to give you information, but part of college is to give you a mentor, to help you find the people who are going to help you have the story and share your abilities the way that you can. It might be a professor, but it could be your peers too. That's one of the coolest types of mentoring, is when you come up with things together. Kind of like at that Institute for Cultural Research. They were exploring, what can film do? What can we do with this? Okay, but not everybody loves make-believe and fairy tales and fun. If someone's living in a make-believe world, they are pretending that things are better, different, or more exciting than they really are, instead of facing up to reality. Okay, remember what I was saying about that optative mood? What might be? And Warner later says, fairy tales emphasize the optimistic aspect of what might be. But is it bad to pretend that things are better, different, or more exciting than they really are, instead of facing up to reality? Remember the C.S. Lewis quote. The times with the enchanted ideas can help us do better when we have to face those difficult realities. So, one thing studying fairy tale TV teaches me is don't be afraid to grow up. Don't let go of making believe that you, this world, and every person you encounter are full of wonder and continuing possibilities. So, can anything old still have a place in contemporary society? Folklore and tradition teach me that humans need connection with the past to savor the present and to create the future. Fairy tales and TV remind me, stories teach us how the world works by virtually immersing us, which is the good part. So we feel like we're experiencing it. You know, with a good storyteller, you want it to keep going. I talked with Lauren's students about binge watching, and that's part of the show cheating, you know? Or spoiler alerts. Stories hook us with suspense, with what's going to happen, but we don't have, TV lets us see it and hear it, but it's virtual. We're not really living it. So it might be harrowing or happy situations with those characters. They might have a lack to overcome, a challenge to meet, and a better life to seek. And fairy tales remind us that it can be better, even if there's a lot of bad stuff going on. So now I'm a little cheesy, but I encourage you to be a beekeeper of your media. Be wary, okay? The girls in Snow White and Rose Red, they didn't want to answer the door, and when they saw the bear, they ran and hid in some versions. It's okay to look before you leap. That would be a proverb. But be open, because there's another proverb that says, he who hesitates is lost. So be open, let it out. Be artful. Find the ways that you can create what you need to make. Some people might say, I love, one of Lauren's students said, she watches TV when she's brain dead and can soak it in. I think that's a really good combination of kind of what TV does. We look like we're just sitting there, but we're really soaking it in. And we have, from that soaking in, we can make something of that. And so be believing that This world is worth it. Your own experiences are worth it. You have something to contribute. So keep noticing, keep moving. It doesn't necessarily all come at one time either. That's what I like about both Nicole's story and Lottie's. They didn't know how it was going to all work out, but they kept moving forward. They kept finding the opportunities. And most important, keep sharing. Share now. Share what you're thinking. Share what you can make or what you're afraid you can't make, but you still want to try it. Keep sharing. Thank you very much. Okay, I have no idea. Do we have time for questions? Yes. Okay, that's a really interesting question, and it's actually a question that reminds us to remember that data is coming from somewhere and that it might not have the whole picture. So just maybe in the time that Lauren was there, we entered more of the Once Upon a Time episodes, and once we started doing that, if you know Once Upon a Time, Snow White appears much more often than Cinderella. They kind of brought her back, I think, in the very last season. So once we just adding those to our database, went back to Snow White, became the winner. I'm trying to think who was the third runner-up, and I don't recall. Very good question. Thank you. Yes. I think it sort of was just back there that it was not the one that Disney did, but it taught me that there were more types of fairy tales out there. I didn't want to teach fairy tales as a folklorist. I didn't. For the first 11 years, I taught all sorts of other types of folklore. And students would write in their comments, so remember, do your student evaluations because I promise people read them. Students would always say, it wasn't what I expected, but eventually I liked it. And I realized when one class gave me a book of fairy tales, like as a parting gift, it was like, I didn't teach you fairy tales because I wanted you to know there's so many more traditions. And what they wanted me to know was, we don't care. Fairy tales are a big tradition that we want to know about. And so I finally put them in. And students told me about seeing the statue of the Little Mermaid in the harbor in Copenhagen, where it's like this country really loves that story enough that they put a statue in the harbor. And that was one of the first things that his friends from the country took him to do, was we've got to go see the statue. And then another group was assigned to talk about Snow White, and it happened to be the day Sydney White and the Seven Dorks, the movie, appeared. And so it was like, these stories are out there. We don't necessarily just sit around with friends and tell them to each other, but we keep them in books. We put them in movies. Eventually I figured out that I could actually study what they did on TV. So I started to think, maybe there's more going on here than I have given good old fairy tales credit for, and should take more of a look. Yes? That is a great question, and we, as a group of researchers, we would debate, is it a fairy tale, isn't it a fairy tale? We drove our computer programmer crazy because we were more nebulous about our categories than he liked. Yes, I would say Midsummer Night's Dream came to mind, but back to that skeleton idea, yes, and we know that Shakespeare was an adapter. He was finding older stories and he was telling them in his own way. So Yeah. And some students have mentioned like supernatural, Game of Thrones. Someone wondered, is Game of Thrones a fairy tale? It's sort of a time period that we associate, and it may have some of the same plots. So, yeah. And then we have to ask, well, what do we get if we call it a fairy tale? What do we get to do because it's a fairy tale? Sometimes it will sell more. If we call it a fairy tale, then people will find it and they'll want it more. Sometimes it might put people off, and they might just think, I've outgrown fairy tales. Thank you. Yes? Witch hunters, I think, yes. That, I would look at it because it still has the name of Hansel and Gretel. The interesting thing, I don't think that one did very well at the box office. There was this dark movement toward darker tales, and so we got something like that. I don't think it did so well. Jack the Giant Killer was a movie in about that same time where people were, but I think it's still, yes. If you wanted to write a paper about it, David, I would, in my folklore class, I could say yes. But it's interesting to see where maybe it moves too far, that maybe it wasn't fairy tale enough for people to have the parts of fairy tale that they like. Maybe that's why it wasn't so popular. So you can see how people who tell stories might want to figure out what is the parts that resonates with people so that their story can catch on. But it's really interesting how we have different abilities, our antenna for it. I had a student who wrote, her master's thesis was a Cinderella retelling. I thought it was really obvious. It was like Glass and Ember or something was her title. That sort of says Cinderella to me. But one of the professors didn't really catch on. And so it's okay to interpret in different ways. Okay. Yes, please. Thank you very much.